Okay. Good morning, everybody. We all arrived at the correct time. The time change. We're going to go ahead and pray, and then we'll get started. Dear Father, we just come before you this morning, and we want to acknowledge you, Lord, because you are the one that is the maker of the heavens and the earth. You have formed each and every one of us, Lord, from the time we were in our mother's womb. You've given us life. You've given life to all living creatures on this earth. And so we thank you for that. We can see the way that the nature, the way that the creation testifies to your glory and your workmanship. We can see your hand in all that is in existence. And so we say, how can there not be a God? And not only that, Lord, but we know that you love us and you have concern for us, so much so that you came into your creation to redeem us, to rescue us from our sin. And we thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so I think we may finish up here this morning with the secular humanist worldview. I'm not sure how long it'll take to get through that. So if we do, we might get into Marxism today, but if not, we'll start talking about Marxism next week. I think Marxism is very relevant to today because we see a lot of Marxist influence in our society, even here in America. But last week we have been talking about the arguments for the existence of God to kind of counter the claims of secular humanist worldview. We talked about the cosmological argument, which says that everything with a beginning must have a cause. It's a scientific principle. It's accepted as fact in the scientific community. And since the universe had a beginning, which also science points to, therefore the universe had to have a cause. And the universe can't cause itself. So really naturalism can't be true. Because how can the natural world come into existence? How can it will itself to exist? Did any of you will yourself to exist? Right? You're here. You had nothing to do with that. You had nothing to say with that. So how can nothing will itself to say, I want to exist, I'm going to make myself exist? It just doesn't work. And then we talked about the teleological argument. And that's the argument from design, that there is a lot of design in the universe that we see. And so I think that's where we didn't quite finish talking about that today. We talked a little bit about like DNA and things like that, and how DNA, the amount of information inside every one of your cells, could fill libraries full of encyclopedias of information. And, you know, like I said, if you just throw, my daughter has like those little alphabet sets, you know, like the magnet ones and things like that. If you just take a pile of those letters and just throw on the floor and expect that to just like spell out and communicate an intelligent message, no one is going to expect that to happen, right? And that's just a few letters that you throw on the floor. And this is an encyclopedia, over 1,000 Encyclopedia Britannicas. And all the letters are just in the right sequence to spell out words and to spell out, to communicate sentences and paragraphs and information. And then that's what's going on in your cells. And so how would that be all by chance? The probability of that is astronomical. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the origins here today of the universe. How do we know what happened in the past? And there's a lot of assumptions made by those in the secular humanist worldview about what happened in the past. Because, again, I might have said this before, but the assumption of a secular humanist is that God doesn't exist. The assumption of a secular humanist is that naturalism is true. Okay, naturalism being that all that exists is the natural world and nature and the physical material universe. That's it. Supernaturalism is the opposite of that. That says, okay, yes, there is a natural world, there's a material, physical universe, but there's also a supernatural realm Okay, and so that would be God. And so there's this supernatural being outside of the material universe that creates the universe and interacts in the universe. So that's the opposite. So there's a philosophical assumption that begins with anyone who is dealing with science in a secular worldview, because they just assume that naturalism is true. They assume that God doesn't exist, and so therefore they have to assume that certain things had to take place in the past, because it would have to for their worldview to be true. And so determining what happened in the past really is what's called a forensic science. And so that's a term you probably are familiar with. Where do you hear that term? Forensics? Huh? Oh, the crime shows, yeah, exactly. And so in the crime shows, what are they trying to figure out? Who did it, right? But were the detectives, were they there? No, so that's why it's forensic science. They weren't there. They had to figure out from the clues, from the evidence, what happened. And so that's basically what we're doing with science and trying to figure out, well, what happened in the past. And so here's a couple terms to think about with that. One is called principle of uniformity, saying that the causes in the past are the same as today. So basically saying laws of nature, laws of physics, they're the same, right? We observe them today, so we assume that they were always the same. We would say that a natural cause that happened in the past would be the same as today. And we'd say an intelligent cause in the past would be the same in the past as it is today. And so that's how we can figure it out. So we know that things don't just pop into existence, right? We don't see that happening at all. So we can assume that that's how it's always been. Things don't just pop into existence. Life doesn't just come from non-life. That has not been observed in science at all. But yet, that's what secular humanists are doing. They are saying, well, if naturalism is true, then there is no supernatural, and life did have a beginning, then they have to assume that life did come from non-life, and that material did pop into existence from no material. And so that's a pretty big assumption, and you got to take that. You have to have a lot of faith to believe in that. I think you talk about, you Christians just believe it because you have faith. You just believe in stuff without evidence. They are believing. I think it's a lot harder to believe what they do, because there is no evidence for what they believe. And with Christianity, we do have evidence. And we talked about that before. Over the first month or two of this course, we looked at why Christianity is a reasonable faith, why it's not just faith, but it's also reason. And same for this. I mean, it's what is it in the sense that, but they don't have any reasonable proof to believe some of these things, that non-life came from life or material came from nothing. So here is another thing they have to believe on the next slide, life from non-life. Okay, so they assume that then something called spontaneous generation is true. So this is basically that non-living material, spontaneous, for an inexplicable reason, just decides to, and is able to, come to life. So protein molecules just come together and just, I don't know, maybe zap a little lightning in there, and all of a sudden it's a living, breathing thing. It's alive, right? Like Frankenstein or something. That has never happened. There has never been any observation of non-life turning into life in science. And so they have to believe that at some point in the past that did happen, because if it didn't, then naturalism can't really be true. Because if naturalism is true, then all life had to come from, well, there isn't anything outside the box, right? So it has to come from within the box. And so it would have to create itself. It would have to come to life itself. So you need, it says here, 200 protein molecules for life. For life to exist, you have to have 200 molecules of protein come together. And so here it says, one protein molecule being generated is the same chance as a blindfolded man finding the same marked grain of sand in the Sahara Desert 3 times in a row. Does anybody know where the Sahara Desert is? So you can imagine how big that is. Sahara Desert. Okay, Sahara Desert is in northern Africa. Okay, so imagine the entire northern part of the continent of Africa, that's the Sahara Desert. And so imagine that there's just one little grain of sand and they just randomly put it somewhere in that vast desert that spans the whole top of that continent. And then you're blindfolded and they say, go search around that desert and then find that grain of sand blindfolded. Oh, and now do it 2 more times. That equals the probability of what it would be for non-life to come to life. And so basically, no, that's not going to happen. The chances of it are 0, and we don't observe it happening. So, but to make their worldview work, they have to assume that it did happen. They say, well, we know that worldview is true, so we know that had to happen. And again, that just takes a lot of faith to believe in something like that. And okay, so now to solve that problem, to say, well, we don't see these things happening, or it's very improbable that everything is lined up the way it is for life to exist, and et cetera, et cetera. So the claim that they give to that then is, if given enough time and enough chance, you'll finally get it right. Okay, so they say, so that's why in the secular worldview they require the universe to be much older. For evolution to work, it has to be a lot older to have enough time for the low probability to have a chance. And so the answer to that is, you could talk about irreducible complexity. And well, what irreducible complexity is when you have something that you can't reduce it to its individual part. You can't take any part away. If you take any of the parts away, it's not going to be a full functioning organism. Okay? So for something to be a full and functioning organism, and it has to over time acquire these different traits to be a full functioning organism, well, if it didn't start off as a full functioning organism, it's never going to be able to evolve into what it is today. So it's just not going to happen. And that's the problem of irreducible complexity. So according to intelligent design, so number 1, irreducible complexity is the removal of any of the parts which causes the system to cease functioning. All right, so you put machinery together, you put a car together, you take out one of those parts, it's not going to function, right? Without one of those parts. So you can't say, well, for this organism to function, it eventually evolved, this part or that part. Well, if it didn't have that part in the beginning, it wouldn't be able to function in the first place, to survive, to continue to reproduce, to evolve over time, to gain those traits, because it wouldn't have been able to function without those in the first place. Number 2, specify complexity. It says complex patterns in organisms must be accounted for by some sort of guidance. And number 3, the anthropic principle. I think we talked about that the other week. The world is fine-tuned to allow for life on Earth. Everything is so finely tuned. The Earth is just the right amount away from the sun, but not too far away. It's tilted at 23.5 degrees, just the right tilt. And just everything in the atmosphere, the thickness of the atmosphere, is even our place in the solar system, even our place in the galaxy, like everything is set just right. We got the planets out there in the outer part of the solar system, like Jupiter and Saturn. They keep, they actually protect us. They take in all the asteroids and stuff that might be heading for Earth. They suck them in, and because they're big, they have this gravity, so they're kind of like a shield for us. So everything is just like placed at the right spot. and everything is finely tuned to create life on this planet. All right, and so now moving on to the final argument for God is something called the moral argument. All right, so we talked about the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and now we're talking about the moral argument. And the moral argument goes like this. Every law has a lawgiver. There is a moral law, therefore, there is a moral lawgiver. Okay? I think that's common sense. We look at the laws in our nation, we don't say, well, they just are, right? Or that the law is our opinion, right? If law was just our opinion, then I could say, well, it's true for me that I get to run through a stop sign, but not for you. You got to stop at the stop sign. Now, if we ran society like that, it would be chaos. And that's kind of what postmodernism is, and that's another worldview we will get to eventually. But we would say, there are people, there's government, they make the laws, and they're the lawgiver. And so, what do we know about the universe and the way things run? Well, we all know that there is something. We all know that there is some kind of a moral law, right? Everybody says, well, it's wrong to tell a lie. It's wrong to steal something. It's wrong to murder somebody. It's wrong to rape somebody. Well, how do we know that those things are wrong? And a lot of people would say, well, I just know it, right? Well, if naturalism is true, the fact that we all kind of have, in general, the same sense of morality, more or less, if naturalism was true, then how could we justify that? Because really, morality would just be a matter of your opinion. You could say, well, it's your opinion that murdering is wrong, right? But we all kind of say, that's wrong. Why? Why do we know that that's wrong? There has to be a standard outside of ourselves, because if not, it would be our opinion. So, in baseball, an umpire calls a strike. How do you know that's a strike? Well, there's a strike zone, right? From the letters to the knees, and then only the width of the home plate. That's a strike. Okay? And then sometimes, there might be a bad call, and maybe it's a little bit low, maybe it's a little bit outside, and the umpire calls it a strike, and then you argue with the umpire. But by what standard are you arguing with the umpire? Because maybe it's just your opinion that that's a ball. And it's the opinion of the umpire that's a strike. Well, what governs that? Well, there's rules of the game, right? That are outside of the players and the game and the umpire. And so the same thing is kind of in our world. There's these kind of rules that we go by. Okay, some people try to break them, or I think in many cases people, if they do break them or do think something's not wrong, I think what you probably see happening is they're probably trying to justify it or change it, or to change the language to say, well, I'm not really doing such and such, right? Abortion is a big one, because everyone will say, I don't think anyone would stand up here and say, well, I think murdering is correct and it's a moral duty. Nobody would say that. So they say, well, how can somebody murder their child in the womb? Well, that's because they don't think it's murder, because they don't think it's a human being. See, so they have to justify it. But deep down in our heart, we know that murdering is wrong. Killing innocent human beings is wrong. Everybody knows that. But again, the question is why? How do we know that? Because if naturalism is true, we'd just be a bunch of animals just acting according to instinct. It would just be whatever we feel like, whatever we want to do. We have no moral obligation or duty to care about whether or not we hurt other people. But yet we do know it. And the Bible says that the law is written on our heart, so that we know what's right or wrong. We don't even need the Bible to tell us that. We know it. But we try to twist it, distort it. We try to twist. That's what Satan tries to do: twist, distort, lies, deceit, and get us off track. But we know that there's a moral law. So here are some, I think I talked about this before, the roadrunner tactic, how you can respond to some of these ideas. The roadrunner tactic is, if you've ever seen the cartoons with Roadrunner, okay? And sometimes Roadrunner, or Wile E. Coyote's chasing the Roadrunner, and Roadrunner like runs right off a cliff or something. Sorry, the other way around. He stops at the edge of a cliff, and Wile E. Coyote just keeps running right off the cliff, and then he realizes he's not standing on ground anymore, and then as soon as he realizes it, he falls to the canyon floor, right? Because he has no ground to stand on. That's why it's called the Roadrunner tactic. A lot of these truth claims in secularism and so forth, and postmodernism especially, as we'll get into, they don't have any ground to stand on. A lot of their claims, their truth claims, are very self-refuting. If you apply the claims to themselves, they will refute themselves. So here's one of the claims. There are no absolute moral values. Okay, there are no moral absolute values, saying that morality is not absolute, it's just subjective, it's your opinion. A Roadrunner response to that is, a person who denies all values still values their right to deny moral values, right? So a person is making a value claim there when they say there are no absolute moral values. So if that statement is true, then it's false, because you don't have a right to say that. You don't have a right to state your value of saying that there are no moral absolutes. It's self-refuting. Here's another one. All morality is relative. Okay, so relative to the individual, relative to culture, to geography, to societies, different groups of people. And that's what they're saying. The response to that, from the Roadrunner's response, is, a person is a moral relativist only until an act of immorality is committed against them. Moral laws are not always the standard by which we treat others, but it is the standard by which we wish to be treated. And that's how you can know something's wrong, okay? That something is immoral to do. Because some people might say, that's not a big deal if I just steal their pencil, if another student steals another student's pencil or something like that. But it's not a big deal. But then as soon as something like that's done to them, that's a moral outrage. How dare they do that to me, right? And so if it really wasn't wrong to do that, then you know what? You wouldn't care if somebody did it to you. But that's how we know it's wrong, because it hurts the other person. And so that's really what morality can, Jesus summed up the law. Okay? The law is basically, can be summed up in two things. What are they? Anybody know? I'll give you a hint. It starts with love. Yep, and what was the other one? Love God and love others, right? So basically, love God, the Lord your God, with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said this sums up the law. Okay? That really boils it down and simplifies it, doesn't it? Okay, so you ask yourself, is what I'm doing loving towards God? And is what I'm doing loving towards other people? If not, then that's immoral. And so that's what I'm saying here with this, is that, how do we know? Well, when it hurts somebody else, then we know that that's wrong. And we might not notice that if we're doing it to somebody else, because it doesn't hurt me. But so as soon as it's done to us, then we feel the effects of that, right? So it's, okay and fun to steal something from somebody else until something is stolen from me, right? That hurts me. Somebody steals my car. I can't get to work. That really puts me in a difficult position. So the person that did that was not being very loving. Or, you say, well, it could be fun to sleep around with whoever we want to, but that hurts and that breaks relationships. That's hurting. That's being hurtful to other people. And so, and also against yourself. The Bible says that any other kind of sin a man commits is outside of his body, but sexual immorality is committing against his own body. So it could even hurt yourself. And so you can definitely see that, because if it wasn't hurting other people, okay, and you may not notice that hurt that you're doing to other people, but then why is it that when it's done to you, then it's all of a sudden you demand justice? Because we know that that's wrong. The next one is, the claim is, if there really is a good and just God, why does he allow evil to exist? This is what's called the problem of evil. I don't really think it's a problem to explain why evil exists, but a lot of people try to refute the existence of God because of it. But again, if God didn't exist, how would you know what evil is? You're borrowing the standard of morality from God to argue against him, really. So the Roadrunner response to this is, to what are we comparing? Yeah, so that's what I was saying. So it's comparing our idea of just and unjust if there is no objective standard outside of ourselves. Yeah. Okay. So, so that's why it's self-defeating. But, I mean, real quickly, to answer that question, I guess, real simply, is why does evil exist? Because, a lot of people will say, hey, if God exists, then there's a deficiency there, because if God is all loving, or all good, I should say, then he must be not all powerful, because if he was all good, he would want to stop evil. So if he would want to stop evil, why doesn't he? Well, I guess he just can't. And then the other view says, well, maybe God is all powerful. Well, then if he's all powerful, he could stop evil, but he doesn't stop evil, so guess what? He must not be loving, and that's what the argument is. And so they say, see, God can't exist, even though they're borrowing from God's morality, standard morality, to argue against him. The answer to that question is that God must allow for the possibility of evil if free will is to exist. If God created man and programmed him to just love him, and didn't give an opt-out, so to speak, in the garden, then there wouldn't be real love. Love has to be a decision, it has to be a choice. And so God wanted love of human beings to be out of choice, not out of program. And we just be robots in that case. So God placed that tree in the garden as not a temptation, but as here's an opt-out decision if you want it, because I'm not going to force you to love me. And so with free will, then the inevitable consequence of that is it allows for evil. And so then a lot of people argue, okay, then why doesn't God eradicate evil? And why doesn't he do it now? And a lot of times, God does deal with evil now. There are many examples in Scripture where we see that God deals with evil. But many cases where he does deal with evil, that's where people complain about God himself being immoral. Again, they're using God's standard of morality to judge God. So that's kind of ironic. But the big example is when God tells Israel to go into the land that he promised to them. What does he tell them to do with the people that are living there? You guys remember? Okay, God tells them to go into the land of Canaan and to do what? Be friends with them? Yeah, kill them all, right? And so that's where people will say, look, that's really immoral of God to do that. God is a moral monster. He's evil. To wipe out, that's genocide, right? But what we see God doing there is he's taking care of a problem of evil that was taking place. These people that were living in that land were so wicked. They were killing their own infants, sacrificing them to these gods. They had become so evil and so corrupt that God actually gave them a lot of chance. He gave them hundreds and hundreds of years of a chance, of opportunity to repent. He actually says this to Abraham earlier. He says that the full level of their evil has not reached its peak yet. He said, but it will, and then we will deal with them then. And so God is dealing with the evil things that those people were doing. His judgment came upon them. So God does, but then people argue against him and say, he was mean. No, he dealing with evil, because you complain other times that he doesn't deal with evil. And the other thing is that God will ultimately, in an ultimate sense, and in a final sense, will ultimately deal with evil and put a permanent end to evil. He will stop, and that's in the last day when Jesus returns. And all will be set right. And justice will prevail, and everyone will be repaid according to what they have done. For those of us that believe and trust in Christ, we can be forgiven, because that's the other thing. People want God to take care of evil. Well, aren't we also evil? God really, he has the right, and he could do this. He could wipe every one of us out right now, because none of us are innocent. None of us are without sin. We all do evil in our lives all the time. So we want God to take care of evil, but not when it comes to me. I get a free pass. So God does deal with evil. God does set things right. He is all powerful, and he is all loving, and he does care, and he will, in an ultimate sense. And even throughout history, we see where God does intervene and act to stop acts of evil that take place. But sometimes God allows it for a time. So we get that. But that's because God allows evil to fit into his ultimate plan. So God sometimes permits evil. We see the example of in the book of Job, you get the curtain pulled back, you get a little bit of a behind-the-scenes look of kind of what goes on in the spiritual realm. You see Satan comes before God one day, and they start talking about Job, and God says, "Have you seen my servant Job?" Satan says, "Yeah, but he only loves you because you've given him everything. Take that away from him, then let's see how he loves you." So God actually permits Satan to do evil to Job's family. But God does put a restriction there. He says, "But on the man himself, do not lay a finger." And then the second time around, God says, "Okay, now you can lay a finger on him. You can actually physically harm him, but you cannot kill him." So God does allow and sometimes extends the permission to allow things to happen in our lives. But sometimes he pulls that back and doesn't allow those things to happen. But it's all because it's part of God's sovereign plan. And we don't always know what that is. And that's the point of the book of Job, is we don't know. We don't know the answers. And you know what? And that's okay. We don't have to know all the answers. But what we can know is that God does deal with evil. He will, in an ultimate sense, deal with evil. We just have to be patient and trust in him. And but again, I love this, how we use God's standard of justice and morality to argue against him and say, "God, you're unjust and you're immoral." By what standard? You're using God's standard to judge him by his own standard. So that doesn't hold up. That's a good one. Okay, another claim is there is not, I guess I should say, there is no objective lawgiver. The Roadrunner response to this is, if a moral lawgiver does not exist, then there cannot be an objective moral law. What is good or evil would be merely a matter of opinion. So rape, murder, being evil would only be a person's opinion. So I think we kind of just talked about that a little bit. All right, next claim is moral law doesn't exist. This is saying there's no moral law. Roadrunner response to that is, if no moral law exists, there's not, I keep saying not, so I think I should say no. There is no moral difference between the behavior of Hitler or Mother Teresa. Everybody kind of looks at, I think that, you can look at any kind of person and say, in your own mind, you kind of do this, maybe subconsciously, that person kind of fits more on the spectrum towards being a good person, or they're more over towards the evil side. And so you compare two figures like Mother Teresa with Hitler, and you would say, well, Hitler is really, he's evil. Mother Teresa, she was good. But if there's no moral law, how do you know that? How do you know that? How do you know that giving to the poor is good? How do you know that killing 6 million Jews is bad? What makes that bad? Why is murder wrong? Okay, because if there's no authority of law outside of ourselves, outside the universe, just do what you want, right? And And I think that's what some people try to do, is they want to do what they want to do. In Judges, it says, in those days they had no king, and everyone did what they saw fit in their own eyes. But still, at the same time, I think deep down, even if we try to suppress it, we know that certain things are wrong. Murdering is wrong. Rape is wrong. Lying and stealing is wrong. We know those things. Next one is, we cannot know what's right, but we can know what's wrong. Okay? So this is one that they claim. Okay, so it says here, how can you know what's wrong if you have no idea of what is right? Okay, you have to know what's right. So for example, 2 plus 2 does not equal 5. Okay, we know that's wrong. How do you know that's wrong? You only know that's wrong because you know that the right answer is 2 plus 2 equals 4. I think C.S. Lewis said something like this. He said, I wouldn't know what a crooked line was unless I saw a straight line. We have to have some idea of what's right so we can compare it to say, well, that's wrong. Because maybe the crooked line is the right way and the straight line is the wrong way. But we know that the straight line is the right way. So, next one. Everyone should have the right to an abortion or gay marriage. This is a claim that's made by a lot of atheists. Of course, right? Because they're denying God. And so they would say these types of moral issues shouldn't actually be moral issues because these are based on archaic understandings of morality that come from a fairy tale of God that is created in the minds of humans that we created. And so let's throw that idea out. Everyone should have this right for an abortion or gay marriage. Okay, by what standard then are you making those arguments that everyone should have a right to those things? Okay, who says that they should have a right to those things? Well, without an idea of objective morality, you cannot claim a moral right to anything. Again, it just comes back to, it would be your opinion. So, again, they're using the morality of God, they're using the standard that comes from a moral lawgiver above ourselves, and using that for their own argument. But he doesn't exist. But it's convenient for them to use his objective morality, the standard morality, when they want to argue their own point. Next one. You need to tolerate my lifestyle. Okay, that's a claim that's made by a lot of atheists as well. You need to tolerate my lifestyle. So when we get into postmodernism, we'll talk about what is tolerance. Okay, because I think the word tolerance has been redefined today, and it means something else. But a Roadrunner response is, asking for tolerance shows that you know your behavior is wrong because no one has to ask anyone to tolerate moral behavior. You don't need to tolerate me being kind to you. You don't need to tolerate me giving to you. You don't need to tolerate me doing any kind of moral good to you. Like nobody would say, I'm really tolerating and being nice, Like nobody says that. Tolerance only comes when something is being done that is out of line. Okay, and then we need to tolerate that. And tolerance is, what tolerance is. Here's how I would define it. This is not how the world would define it today. But tolerance would be, if somebody has a different viewpoint or opinion than you, then that means you tolerate that person. You tolerate the fact that they have a different opinion. Okay? I believe God exists, someone else doesn't believe God exists. Okay, I tolerate that person. I'm not going to discriminate against that person. I tolerate them. But here's what the world would like you to think it means today. Tolerance means you need to agree with me. Okay? You need to agree with me that a woman has the right to an abortion. You need to agree with me that gay marriage is a right that comes from the government. Okay, that's what they mean. And if you have a different opinion than me, then you're intolerant. That's what they mean by tolerance today. Well, that's not tolerance at all, because in fact, they're actually, by telling you that you need to get in line with their point of view, then in fact, they are not tolerating you. Because they're not tolerating the fact that you have a different opinion than them. So, tolerance, right? And so that's the whole thing today. Diversity, equity, equity and inclusion, right? And tolerance, all in the name of tolerance. Okay, but if they were really tolerant in the way that they claim that they are, then they would allow Christians or anybody that has a different viewpoint or opinion than them to continue to have a different opinion or viewpoint than them, but they don't. They demand that you get in line with their point of view. And see, that's how the term tolerance has been hijacked today. It does not mean what it should mean. But again, so if you demand that, if you're making the demand that we need to tolerate you in the sense of we need to agree with you, okay, well, you're again borrowing from a moral standard somewhere to make a claim that you have that right. If secular humanism worldview is true, and there's no God, then you have no leg to stand on. You have no right to claim that you have that right. Okay. And the last one here, or the conclusion here. So, what we can glean from all this is that an absolute standard of morality exists that is written in our hearts, and that's from the Bible. The Scripture says that it's written in our hearts. We know it. Also, relativism is false. Relativism being that idea of morality is different for different people, different individuals. It's false because we are all aware of a higher moral law. If there was no moral law, then it would all be a matter of opinion. And finally, if moral law exists, it has to have a higher lawgiver. And so, again, like I said, with the rules of any kind of sport, if the rules of the game, basketball, baseball, whatever it is, were not invented, then everybody that's out on the field or on the court, they could just do whatever they want. It could be a free-for-all. In fact, American football was kind of like that when it first started. And actually, President Theodore Roosevelt was the one that said, we need to get some rules in place for this game, so we have some guidelines for it so people aren't dying on the field, right? And so they created the rules for football. Because it was kind of like almost like whatever kind of thing. I guess there were a few rules, but just imagine if there were no rules in sports. If it was just a matter of every single player every single player on the field played by whatever their opinion was. Okay, they could do it. And I remember playing soccer in the schoolyard when I was young, and it was kind of frustrating to me because everybody played it in a postmodern kind of way because I played it the way that you should. You know, you can only use your feet. But some of the other kids were like, oh, cool, I'll just pick up the ball and carry it with my arm like a football and just run down the field with it. Well, that's not the rules of the game, but we were playing by however we wanted. It was our opinion, whatever we wanted to do, right? Because there was no referee, there was no official to tell us. But again, it's not even about the referee or the official, it's about the rules of the game. Where did the rules of the game come from? Well, some people somewhere had to sit down and say, here, we're going to draw up the rules. These are the rules of the game, and this is what everyone that plays this game, this sport, has to abide by. It's not determined by the people on the field. And so we have to acknowledge that there's got to be a moral lawgiver that transcends the universe. And so that's the moral argument. Okay? So the next thing we're going to talk about, so that concludes the secular humanist worldview, okay? So we're going to keep moving on along here. We have Marxism to get to next. So I can do a brief introduction of that today. And I think Marxism is a worldview. Let's see. I can pull it up. I guess I cannot. I thought I made it available that I could get it offline, but I guess not. Do you have the slides that you can put up? You do. Okay, I'll just have to look behind me then. Earlier today, I clicked to make it available offline for me, but it says I can't access it because I'm not online. So go ahead, go to the first slide. Okay, so there we go. Marxism. If you just put up those bullet points there for us. Okay, it begins with a guy named Karl Marx. There he is. And he wrote in 1848, with, his name was Friedrich Engels. So these were some German scholars that came up with the idea of communism, and they wrote the Communist Manifesto, which is this idea that it just breaks down, it says basically that there are two classes of people. There's the bourgeoisie and there's the proletariat. And the bourgeoisie, they're the rich ruling class, and they have control of everything. And the proletariat are the lower class people, and there's this class struggle between the two. And so what it comes down to is there are two classes of people in the world: the oppressors and those that are being oppressed. And so it has to be the oppressed that will rise up. The proletariat needs to rise up and overthrow the system of the bourgeoisie and replace it with their own system. And so that's kind of what communism is. And so they look at it in terms of economics as a big part of it. But we're going to see as we go through this that there are actually a lot of other movements today that are very much influenced by Marxism. And so you might recognize some of these because they have infiltrated our nation. They are in our colleges. Students in colleges are being indoctrinated with this. And yes, even in some of our Christian colleges and universities as well. So these would be things like critical race theory, or feminism, or social justice movements and things like that. It's infiltrated the churches. We see these types of ideas in churches that are part of a movement called progressive Christianity, which is neither progressive nor Christian. So this is, if you think, why are we talking about Marxism? Why are we talking about communism? Well, because it's a big deal in our culture today. And so you're going to come across a lot of people that are going to have, even if they don't know it, they're going to have some influence in their life from the Marxist worldview. And so that's what we'll talk about. So we go to the next slide here a second. Here's a little bit about what they believe in. So right down the line here, we say, well, what's wrong with Marxism? What's wrong with these ideas? Okay, what's wrong with critical race theory? What's wrong with feminism and so forth? And we're going to talk about each of those in turn. Well, first of all, at the core, we can't support it, because look, the number one, the bottom, the core of it, the baseline of it is that they believe that God does not exist. They're atheists. How in the world are we going to support things from a worldview that doesn't even acknowledge the existence of God? They want God out of the picture. So we can't support that. The nature of man, okay, they look at man as, we're basically good. We're not sinful. It's actually people groups that sin. It's societies as a whole that sin. That's why you see today, like for example, critical race theory says all white people are just racist. Okay, maybe not an individual white person, but white people as a whole, they're racist. Because it's people groups that sin. Okay, and so when they look at religion, they think God is just what they call an opioid for the masses. So they think that it was just a way for people to feel good about themselves, that, ancient people a long time ago came up with this idea of this fatherly figure in the sky, because you know what, life is horrible, life is rough. We need something to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. So they said, well, people just made up this idea of God. And people deluded themselves. They under this delusion. And so they think that these ideas from the ancient times are oppressive. They look at Christianity as oppressive. The claim I hear a lot of times is that Christianity is a white man's religion. Jesus wasn't even white. And it started in the Middle East, and guess where Christianity was before it even got to Europe? It was in Africa long before it was in Europe. So no, it's not a white man's religion. It's an every person religion. It's, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female. We are all one in Christ Jesus. Okay? Now, has there been times in the past where Christianity has acted in an oppressive way? Sure. So a lot of people throughout history have done a lot of terrible things in the name of Christ, invoking the name of Christ when they're doing it. But that doesn't mean that God is oppressive, or that Christ is oppressive, or that the religion of Christianity is oppressive. It just means that some people aren't playing the tune correctly. John Dixon wrote a book called Bullies and Saints, a great book that came out a few years ago. I loved it. It talked about all the good and the bad of church history. And he compared it to somebody who plays the cello. And somebody who plays the cello poorly, you're not going to blame the person who composed that piece of music. You're not going to say, oh, well, the person that wrote that music is horrible. You say, no, the person that's playing the cello doesn't know how to play the cello. Okay, and so that's kind of what we see going on with Christianity. God is the composer. He wrote the symphony, but some of us don't play the tune correctly. And that shouldn't be on God, that should be on us. We should actually say, look, this is one of the ways that we know Christianity is true, because what does the Bible tell us about people? It tells us that we're sinful. And so even sometimes the people that claim that they're Christians or invoke the name of Christ, whether they really even are truly Christians, because a lot of people that are really truly not Christians claim the name of Christ, but even some of us that are really Christians, sometimes we do terrible things. But that should not be a reflection on who he is. We shouldn't say, well, let's throw it all out. But that's what Marxism wants to do. They're very revolutionary. Instead of trying to reform any kind of broken system, they want to tear it down and get rid of it and replace it with their own. And so that's what we're going to talk about for the next week or two, because I think it's very relevant with what we've seen in the past several years going on in our country. If you're wondering why there's rioting and looting going on in some of these cities and nothing's being done about it, it's Marxism. Because they would say that's their moral right to do that. We need to tear down the system. In the meantime, we don't care who we destroy or who we hurt in the process, because the ends justify the means, is what they would say. So we destroy whoever or whatever is in our path that's keeping us from getting the proletariat to rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie. And when you don't have God in the picture, it just turns into a big mess. So that's what we'll talk about the next few weeks. So I guess that's where we'll stop here today.